The sound of the doorbell chiming upstairs was like the starting gun for the end of my life. Or maybe, the beginning of it. Down here in the basement, the air was cool and smelled of sawdust, paint and ozone from the transformer. It was my sanctuary, the one place in the world I had built for myself, by myself. My wife Catherine called it my man-child cave. Her father Alistair, a man whose tailored suits probably cost more than my car, once referred to it as my elaborate monument to wasted potential. They saw a grown man playing with toys. They saw a pathetic hobby. They never once saw the truth. The truth was laid out before me, sprawling across 3 custom-built plywood tables. It was the town of Havenwood, Pennsylvania, circa 20 years ago, rendered in perfect 1/87 scale. Every shop on Main Street, from the bakery with its faded canvas awning to the hardware store with its dusty window display, was perfect. Every house, every tree, every fire hydrant. I'd spent 7 years of my life on it. 7 years of quiet, meticulous, all-consuming work, and they just saw a toy. Upstairs I could hear Catherine's strained, society hostess voice. She'd be smoothing over the awkwardness, offering the man a drink he probably wouldn't accept. The man was retired, Detective Frank Miller. For 15 years, he was the lead investigator on the Havenwood First National Bank heist, the case that made headlines for being audacious, brilliant, and utterly unsolved. The case that had, by all accounts, broken him. It became his white whale, and when he was forced into retirement, without closing it, a part of him retired from living too. I knew this because I'd read every article ever written about him and the case. Catherine and her family found my hobby childish. They didn't know that the real childish thing was believing you could build a life, a family, on a foundation of stolen money and secrets. They didn't know that my model wasn't a toy. It was a confession, rendered in miniature. It was a perfect, 2-scale replica of the town where her father, Alistair, and her 2 uncles, Gregory and Bernard, pulled off their legendary crime. Every building, every street, and every single train car was a piece of the puzzle I had finally, painstakingly, put together. I ran a finger along the side of a particular boxcar on a siding near the old grain silo. It was a dull, unassuming rust brown, just one of 20 cars on the miniature freight train. But this one was special. I'd painted a tiny, barely perceptible symbol on its side, a stylized bird, a martin, to be precise. And on the roof, in letters so small you'd need a magnifying glass, I'd stenciled a single word: getaway. The basement door opened, and the light from the hallway cut a sharp rectangle onto the concrete floor. "Mike?" Catherine called down, her voice tight with irritation. "Our guest is here. Are you going to come up, or are you going to keep playing with your little things?" I took a deep breath, the smell of my creation filling my lungs one last time. "Send him down, Cat," I said, my voice calmer than I felt. "He and I have something to talk about. The detective is going to be very interested in my little things. I think he'll be particularly interested in the train car I've labeled Getaway." It was time to show them what my wasted potential really looked like. The final piece of the puzzle was about to click into place, and the sound was going to be deafening. It wasn't about revenge, I'd told myself for years. But standing there, waiting for the footsteps of the man who could bring their whole world crashing down, I had to admit the truth. It wasn't about revenge, until it was. The inciting incident, the real beginning of the end, had happened 3 weeks prior. It was Alistair's 70th birthday party. The whole family was gathered at his and my mother-in-law's ostentatious home, a place that always felt more like a museum of wealth than a house. I hated these gatherings. I was the odd one out, the quiet, working-class husband of their precious Catherine. I was Mike, the IT project manager. A stable, respectable job that in their world of vague investments and consulting might as well have been garbage collection. They were all there. Alistair, holding court by the massive stone fireplace, a glass of ludicrously expensive scotch in his hand. My mother-in-law, Camilla, fluttering around making sure everyone saw the new acquisitions on the walls, and the uncles, Gregory and Bernard. Gregory was the loud one, a backslapper with a booming laugh that never quite reached his cold, calculating eyes. Bernard was his shadow, quiet and watchful. They were a unit, the 3 brothers, the architects of the family's fortune, and the keepers of its great secret. Catherine was in her element, gliding through the crowd, laughing, accepting compliments on her dress, on her life. A life I had provided her, ironically. My steady, boring salary paid the mortgage on our nice, normal suburban home. It kept her comfortable while her family's mysterious wealth remained untouchable. a dragon's hoard to be admired but not disturbed. The conversation, as it often did, turned to their past, to the good old days in their hometown of Havenwood. They spoke of it with a kind of fond winking nostalgia. "Remember that old bank, Al?" Gregory boomed, nudging his brother. "The one with the marble columns. Looked like a fortress." Alistair smiled, a slow predatory curving of his lips. "Fortresses can be breached, brother, if you have the right tools, and the right men." They all chuckled, a private, shared laugh that excluded everyone else. Catherine smiled at me, a little apologetically, as if to say, "Here they go again." She thought it was just bravado, old men puffing up their chests. She had no idea she was listening to a victory lap that had been going on for 20 years. Later, one of Catherine's cousins, a young man with more hair gel than sense, asked me what I did for fun. Before I could answer, Catherine jumped in, her voice light and teasing, but with an edge of steel I knew all too well. "Oh, Mike has his trains," she said, and the little circle of people chuckled. "He has a whole little world down in our basement. It's cute." Cute. That was the word she used, a word you use for a puppy or a toddler's drawing. Alistair overheard and walked over, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. "Still at it with the models, son? A man needs a real hobby, something to build character. Golf, sailing, not toys." "It's a craft, Alistair," I said quietly, my jaw tight. "It requires precision, electrical engineering, carpentry, historical research." He waved a dismissive hand. "Whatever you need to tell yourself. The point is, what does it get you? Where's the return on investment?" He looked around at his grand house, at his family draped in cashmere and gold. "You see, Mike, everything a man does should be about building something, a legacy." And that was it, the final straw. The casual, crushing dismissal of the one thing that was truly mine, the one thing I was truly proud of. The hypocrisy of it was suffocating. He was talking about legacy, this man who had built his on a crime. He was lecturing me on a return on investment, when his entire fortune was stolen. In that moment, surrounded by their smug, laughing faces, a cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. They thought my hobby was a joke. I decided then and there that the punchline was going to be on them. That night, I went down to the basement, not to my sanctuary, but to my armory. The project's purpose shifted. It was no longer a historical curiosity. It was a weapon, and I was going to spend the next 3 weeks sharpening it to a razor's edge. The breakdown after Alistair's party wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a quiet internal collapse. I drove home from that party in near silence, with Catherine chattering beside me about who said what, and who wore whom. She was oblivious. She didn't notice the white-knuckled grip I had on the steering wheel or the muscle twitching in my jaw. When we got home, she went upstairs to get ready for bed, and I went downstairs. The basement door clicked shut behind me, and the silence was absolute. I stood there in the dark for a long time, just breathing in the familiar smells. I didn't turn on the main overhead lights. Instead, I flipped a single switch on my control panel. Tiny, warm LEDs flickered to life all across Havenwood. Little lights glowed in the windows of the houses. Street lights cast long miniature shadows. The world I had built was peaceful, orderly and sane. Everything my life with Catherine's family was not. I slumped into the worn-out armchair I kept in the corner, the one I'd rescued from a curb. My head fell into my hands. The weight of 20 years of their condescension, their subtle mockery, their casual cruelty, came crashing down on me. It wasn't just about the train set. It was never just about the train set. It was about everything. It was about how they saw me. I was the stable, boring provider, the prop for their perfect daughter, the court jester whose cute hobby was a source of family amusement. My mind started replaying a highlight reel of 1,000 little cuts. I remembered our 5th anniversary. I'd saved up for months to take Catherine to a little inn on the coast. I was so proud. I'd made the reservation, planned the whole weekend. The night before we were supposed to leave, her father called. There was a family emergency. It turned out the emergency was that Gregory's son had gotten into some trouble at his expensive boarding school, and Alistair had decided the whole family needed to have a summit at his house to discuss it. When I protested, gently, that we had non-refundable plans, Catherine had looked at me with genuine confusion. "But Mike, this is family," she'd said. "The inn will still be there next year. This is important." We didn't go. We never did. The money was just gone. It was important, but my effort, my money, my feelings, they weren't. I remembered the time I got a major promotion at work. I was the lead on a massive company-wide system migration. It was a huge success. I came home bursting with the news, a bottle of champagne in my hand. Catherine was on the phone with her mother. I waited, practically vibrating with excitement. When she hung up, she turned to me with a huge smile. Guess what? Bernard's daughter got into the equestrian club. We spent the next half hour talking about how proud they all were of my 14-year-old niece-in-law for learning to ride a horse. My promotion was eventually mentioned, somewhere between a discussion about the weather and what to have for dinner. I got distracted. Oh, that's nice, honey. It was a constant grinding erosion of my sense of self. They didn't do it with overt malice. They did it with the casual indifference of people who believe they are the main characters in everyone's story. My life, my achievements, my feelings were always secondary to the grand ongoing drama of the family. And the money, my God, the money. It was a ghost that haunted our marriage. They had it, but it was never liquid. It was in trusts and holdings, yet they lived like kings. Meanwhile, my paycheck covered everything. The mortgage, the cars, the vacations, the endless parade of little things Catherine needed. When I once suggested we tighten our belts for a few months to build up our savings, she'd looked at me as if I'd suggested we start eating out of dumpsters. Don't be so dramatic, Mike. If we ever really need anything, Daddy will help. But he never did. The promise of his help was just a tool to keep us tethered to him, to keep me in my place as the court-funded jester. Lying to myself had become a full-time job. I'd told myself that Catherine was just caught in the middle, a product of her upbringing. I'd told myself that her family's teasing was harmless, but sitting there in the dark, surrounded by my miniature town, the lies fell away. She wasn't caught in the middle, she was on their side. She enjoyed the status her family's legend gave her while simultaneously looking down on the man whose honest work paid for her lattes. She loved the idea of a stable, dependable husband, but she was embarrassed by the actual stable, dependable man. The model train set started as an escape. It was a hobby I'd had as a kid, one I picked up again after my own father passed away. He'd left me his old set, a few dusty engines and cars in a cardboard box. Setting it up in the basement was a way to feel close to him. At first it was just a simple oval of track on a sheet of plywood. But then, one day, Catherine was telling a story her father had told her about growing up in Havenwood. She mentioned the old mill by the river, and the way the train tracks used to run right behind it. A spark of curiosity hit me. I looked up Havenwood online. I found old pictures, old maps, and I found the stories about the bank heist. The details were fascinating. A crew of 3 men, disciplined and professional. They'd walked in during the town's annual Founders' Day parade, when most of the town and its small police force were distracted. They'd disabled the alarms, cleared out the vault and vanished. No witnesses who could give a clear description. No getaway car ever found. Nothing. It was a perfect crime. The gears in my mind started turning. My IT job is all about systems, seeing how things connect, finding patterns in the data. The police had focused on the roads. They'd set up roadblocks on every highway out of the county. They were looking for a fast car. But what if they were looking at the wrong system? I started digging deeper, not as a husband, but as a project manager. The problem was the disappearance of the money. How do you move that much cash out of a sealed-off town? I became obsessed. I spent my lunch breaks in the digital archives of the local library. I filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the declassified parts of the case file. It took months, but I got them. Piles of dry technical police reports, witness statements, crime scene photos, and I started building. My simple oval of track became a single street in Havenwood, then another. I used the old maps and photos to get it right. It was a challenge, a puzzle. It was intellectually stimulating in a way my job hadn't been for years. I wasn't thinking about revenge then. I was just obsessed with solving the riddle. The clues were buried in the family lore. Little things Catherine would say, things she'd heard 1,000 times and never thought about. Daddy always said the parade was the luckiest day of their lives. That's the day he met Mom, the day of the heist. Uncle Gregory used to work for the railroad, you know.
He always complains about how much stronger the locks on the freight cars are these days. He knew the train system inside and out. Uncle Bernard was always the quiet one. Dad said he could sit in one spot for hours without moving, just watching. Said he had the patience of a sniper. The lookout. I cross-referenced their stories with the case files. The lookout point the police could never figure out. It was the bell tower of the old church, which had a perfect unobstructed view of the bank's front door and the surrounding streets. A perch only a local would know about. Bernard's patience. The diversion. A small, contained fire set in a dumpster on the other side of town, just enough to draw the town's single on-duty fire engine and one of its 3 police cars away from Main Street. Gregory, the former railroad man, and Alistair, the charismatic leader who charmed his future wife while his partners were securing their future. It all fit. The pieces were slotting into place. The final piece was the train. I found the freight schedules for that day. A long, slow-moving mixed freight train was scheduled to pass through Havenwood, right around the time the heist was wrapping up. It was a milk run, a low-priority train that would stop and go, shunting cars onto sidings. It was the perfect cover. No one would be looking for the slowest getaway vehicle in history.
The catalyst, the moment the project turned from a forensic hobby into a weapon of war, was that night, after Alistair's party. I sat in my chair, staring at the model. The smug look on his face burned into my memory. A man needs a real hobby, he'd said. Something to build a legacy. A cold, clear thought cut through my despair. All right, Alistair.
You want a legacy?
I'll give you one. My pain curdled into a purpose. My grief became a blueprint. I was no longer just a model builder. I was an evidence technician. I wasn't just solving a puzzle for my own satisfaction. I was building a case. I looked at my beautiful, meticulous, perfect little town.
They called it a toy, but a toy is something you play with.
This was something else entirely. It was an indictment.
It was a trap, and I was going to spring it.
The resolve didn't feel hot or angry. It felt cold and quiet and absolute.
It was the calmest I had felt in years. I finally had a project with a real return on investment.
The next 3 weeks were a blur of focused, almost manic activity. My secret plan wasn't born in a flash of inspiration. It was assembled, piece by piece, with the same meticulous care I'd used to build the town of Havenwood itself. Every evening, after a day of feigning normalcy at work and exchanging clipped, polite conversation with Catherine, I would descend into the basement.
It was no longer a retreat. It was my operations center.
My foresight had been a slow-burning fuse. For years I'd been gathering the raw materials, not with a clear purpose, but with an instinct for patterns. Now, I was weaponizing that data. I laid out the declassified police reports on a folding table next to the model. I had copies of the original town blueprints from the county records office, obtained through a formal request that had cost me $75 in a 2-hour drive. I had aerial photographs from the U.S. Geological Survey, dating back 30 years. The investigation phase was about connecting the family's narrative to the official record. I created a timeline, a massive spreadsheet that would have made my boss at work weep with joy. In one column, I listed the official events of the Havenwood heist. In another, I input every anecdote, every offhand comment, every funny story I'd heard from Catherine or her family over the past 2 decades. The correlations were chilling. Gregory's hilarious story about the time he'd accidentally locked a railroad inspector in a supply shed for 2 hours. It happened 2 days before the heist, at the exact rail yard where the getaway car would have been staged. Bernard's supposed fishing trip on the day of the parade. The spot he always claimed to love was a secluded bend in the river less than 100 yards from the signal box that mysteriously malfunctioned, holding the freight train in place for a crucial, unscheduled 12 minutes. Alistair meeting Camilla. He'd told the story 100 times. He'd bought her a lemonade from a stand right across from the bank. He was establishing his alibi in plain sight. A charming young man courting a girl, not the mastermind of a major felony happening 50 feet away. The hidden leverage was the train car itself. I spent a week just on that one piece. The police had searched the train, of course, but they were looking for something obvious. A car with a broken lock. A car that was unusually heavy. They didn't find anything, because they didn't know what to look for. I found the clue in a grainy crime scene photo from inside the bank vault. On the floor, amidst some scattered papers, was a small smudged drawing. The official report dismissed it as a doodle left by a bank employee. But when I blew up the image, cleaning it up with photo editing software, my blood ran cold. It was a bird, a martin, the same stylized bird Alistair had doodled on napkins and placemats my entire life. It was his signature, his little tick. He'd probably drawn it subconsciously while waiting for the vault to be emptied, a moment of arrogant flair. To the police, it was nothing. To me, it was the key. The thieves wouldn't have used a car that looked suspicious. They would have used a designated car, one they could identify later, a car that was part of a legitimate shipment. I researched the freight company and found their consignment records for that day. One car on that train was a sealed shipment of machine parts, heading for a factory 2 states away. A heavy, unremarkable cargo. The car was owned by a subsidiary leasing company that, after 3 days of obsessive searching through online business registries, I traced back to a shell corporation, and the director of that shell corporation, listed in the documents from 22 years ago, a man named Alistair Finch, my father-in-law. He hadn't just used the train, he'd owned the very car that carried his loot. It was the most beautiful, elegant, and arrogant thing I had ever seen. They had hidden the money in plain sight, inside their own legally protected property, and sent it on a leisurely cross-country trip to be collected at their convenience. Building the model of that car was my masterpiece. I bought an identical model Boxcar. I weathered it to look used and worn. I duplicated the logos and serial numbers from photos of similar cars of that era. And then, with a brush containing only 3 bristles, I painted the tiny martin onto the side, right where Alistair would have told them to put it. It was my checkmate. During this time, my only confidant was my friend David. We'd known each other since college. He was a lawyer, a sharp, cynical man who had seen the worst of people but had somehow retained his soul. I invited him over one night, telling Catherine I needed help with some wiring for the trains. When he saw the full scope of my project, his jaw dropped. "Mike, I thought you were just putting some tracks down. This is insane." I walked him through it. The timeline, the photos, the shell corporation, the symbol of the martin. I showed him everything. When I was finished, he was silent for a long time, just staring at the miniature town. Finally, he looked at me, his expression grim. "You know what this is, right? You're holding a grenade, and your entire life is in the blast radius. Catherine, Mike, she's your wife, is she?" I asked, my voice flat. "Or am I just the guy who pays the bills while she reaps the benefits of her family's legend?" "David, they mock me for this." I gestured to the model, "for being meticulous, for caring about details. The irony is, I'm using the very skills they despise to uncover the truth they're so proud of hiding. So you're going to blow it all up? Your marriage, everything." "They blew it up a long time ago," I said, my gaze settling on the tiny model of Alistair's house. "They just didn't tell me. I'm just lighting the rubble on fire so they can finally see the damage. She chose them, David, over and over again. She chose the legend over the man. I'm just accepting her choice." Shook his head slowly. "Okay, I get it. I don't like it. What's the plan? You can't just walk into a police station with a toy train and a spreadsheet." That's when I told him about Detective Miller. "This case destroyed him," I explained, pulling up an old newspaper article on my laptop. The headline read, "Ist investigators sidelined, Miller's obsession cited in reassignment. They ruined his career because he wouldn't let it go. He knew something was being missed. He just didn't know what." "I'm not going to the police. I'm going to the man who deserved to solve this case from the beginning. I'm giving him the missing piece." David nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "You're not just getting revenge, are you? You're seeking a very specific, very poetic kind of justice." "They called my work childish," I said. "I'm going to let a grown-up be the judge of that." The first move was a simple email. I found Detective Miller's contact information through a public records search. He lived a quiet life in a small town 100 miles away. My hands trembled slightly as I typed. Subject: a theory on the Havenwood First National case. "Dear Detective Miller, my name is Michael Peterson. I am a private citizen, an amateur historian of sorts. with a deep interest in the unsolved Havenwood heist of 2 decades ago. I know this case was important to you, and I have spent several years studying its intricacies. I believe I have developed a viable theory, supported by significant circumstantial evidence, that explains how the perpetrators moved the money out of town undetected. It is, as you might say, an unconventional theory. It involves the town's infrastructure in a way I don't believe was ever fully explored. I have constructed a detailed 2-scale model of the town as it was on that day to illustrate my findings. I know this sounds eccentric, but seeing it is the only way to truly understand the mechanics of what I believe happened. If you would be willing to entertain the theory of a stranger, I would be honored to show it to you. I live at my address. I am available any evening. Sincerely, Michael Peterson. I hit send before I could lose my nerve. The wait was agonizing. For 2 days there was nothing. I started to think he'd dismissed it as the ramblings of a crank. Catherine's attitude didn't help. She was growing increasingly annoyed by my nightly sojourns to the basement. "Are you ever going to come to bed at a reasonable hour?" she'd ask. "The smell of that paint is getting into the floorboards." She was noticing my shift in demeanor, my quiet intensity, but she misinterpreted it as me withdrawing even further into my pathetic hobby. The antagonist panic began subtly. On the 3rd day, Miller replied. His email was short and to the point. "Mr. Peterson, your email is intriguing. I will be in your area on Friday evening. I can stop by around 7 p.m. Let me know if that is acceptable. F. Miller." I felt a jolt of adrenaline, a terrifying, exhilarating thrill. It was real. This was happening. I replied immediately, confirming the time. That evening at dinner, I told Catherine, "A man is coming over on Friday night," I said, keeping my tone casual. "An old acquaintance who's interested in my work." She raised an eyebrow. "Your work? You mean the trains? Who on earth would be interested in that?" "His name is Frank Miller," I said, watching her face carefully. "He's a retired police detective." There was no flicker of recognition. Why would there be? The name wouldn't mean anything to her, but the title did. A detective. Why is a detective coming to see your toys? "Mike, that's weird. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, Kat," I said calmly. "He's just interested in the historical aspect of the model, the town." She was immediately suspicious and annoyed. "So you're bringing a stranger, a policeman, into our home to look at your childish obsession? Can't you just for once have a normal hobby? Why do you have to be so strange?" "My parents are having their monthly dinner party on Saturday. What am I supposed to tell them? That my husband is now collaborating with the police on his make-believe world?" The panic escalated when she told her father. I heard her on the phone the next day, her voice a low, frustrated murmur from the other room. "I don't know, Daddy. He's just being so weird about it." "A detective?" "No, I don't know his name. Miller, I think." "Why?" There was a long pause. I strained to hear, my heart pounding. I couldn't make out Alistair's words, but the change in Catherine's tone was unmistakable. It went from annoyed to concerned. "Really? Are you sure?" "Okay. Okay, I'll ask him." "No, I agree. It's very strange. I'll handle it." That night she confronted me. "Mike, I spoke to my father. He thinks it's incredibly bizarre that you've invited a detective here. He said you need to be careful. People can misinterpret things. He's worried about you." "He's worried about me?" I asked, a bitter laugh almost escaping my lips. "Yes, he thinks you're getting lost in this fantasy. He wants you to cancel the meeting. He said, it's for the best. For us." "No," I said simply. Her eyes widened. I never said no to her, not about things her father wanted. "What do you mean no?" "I mean I'm not canceling. Mr. Miller is coming on Friday, and I'm going to show him my model. You and your father don't have to worry about a thing." "But Daddy says." "I don't care what your daddy says," I snapped, the words sharper than I intended. "This is my house. This is my hobby, and for the first time in a very long time, I am going to have a guest who actually respects it." The battle lines were drawn. The next 2 days were thick with a tense, unspoken hostility. Catherine was cold and distant. I knew she was reporting back to Alistair. They were worried. They didn't know what they should be worried about yet. But the simple act of me, the docile, predictable Mike,
Taking a stand and inviting a detective into my secret world was enough to set their finely tuned alarms ringing. They were used to me being a harmless joke. The idea that I might be something else, something with agency, was profoundly unsettling to them. Their panic was just a low hum for now, but I knew that on Friday night, it was going to swell into a full-blown siren. Friday arrived like a storm front. The air in the house was heavy and charged. Catherine wasn't speaking to me, communicating only through pointed sighs and the slamming of cabinet doors. Around 6 o'clock, just as I was heading down to the basement to make my final preparations, a car pulled into our driveway. Then another. It was Alistair, Gregory and Bernard. My blood ran cold for a second before the anger hit. Of course, they weren't going to let this happen without a show of force. They were planning an intervention. I met them at the door. Alistair was in the lead, his face set in a mask of paternal concern that didn't fool me for a second. Gregory stood behind him, arms crossed over his massive chest, a thuggish posture he probably thought was intimidating. Bernard hovered in the background, his eyes darting around, assessing, just as I imagined he'd done from the church bell tower all those years ago. "Mike," Alistair began, his voice smooth as oil. "Catherine called us. We were worried. We came to talk." "There's nothing to talk about, Alistair," I said, blocking the doorway. "I have a guest coming. That's what we're here to talk about," he said, trying to push past me. "This detective nonsense. Son, you're playing with fire. You don't know what you're doing." "I think I do," I thought. "I know exactly what I'm doing." Catherine appeared behind them, her face pale. "Mike, please, just listen to him. They're trying to help you. Or control me," I shot back. "There's a difference." That's when the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the tension like a knife. Everyone froze. I felt a surge of grim satisfaction. Their little ambush was a second too late. I sidestepped Alistair and opened the door. Standing on my porch was a man in his late 70s, thin and wiry, with a deeply lined face and eyes that had seen far too much. He wore a simple tweed jacket and an expression of tired skepticism. "Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice a low gravel. "I'm Frank Miller, detective," I said, shaking his hand. His grip was surprisingly firm. "Please, come in. I apologize for the crowd. It seems I'm having a family meeting." Miller's sharp eyes swept over the trio of brothers, then to Catherine. He was a detective to his bones. He could smell the conflict in the room. Alistair, ever the performer, stepped forward, his hand outstretched. "Alistair Finch, I'm Mike's father-in-law. It's a pleasure to meet you, detective. We were just expressing some family concern for Mike. He has a very vivid imagination." The subtext was clear. "My son-in-law is a lunatic. Pay him no mind." Miller gave his hand a perfunctory shake, his eyes never leaving mine. "Is that so?" "My husband gets lost in his fantasies," Catherine added, her voice trembling slightly. "This whole thing, it's just a game to him. I'm so sorry you were dragged all the way out here for this." Her attempt at manipulation was desperate and clumsy. She was trying to frame me as mentally unstable, to discredit me before I could even speak. "He's been under a lot of stress," Gregory boomed, trying to sound sympathetic. "Works too hard, spends too much time alone in that basement. It's not healthy." I just stood there and let them talk. I let them dig their own graves. They were revealing their entire strategy. Paint me as the pathetic delusional hobbyist who had finally snapped. They thought they were managing the situation, controlling the narrative. When they finally ran out of steam, a heavy silence fell. Miller looked from them to me. "Well, Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice dry, "that was quite the introduction. Are you going to show me this model, or did I drive 2 hours to witness a family drama?" A slow smile spread across my face. "The model is downstairs, detective. The family drama, I believe, is about to follow us." I turned and led the way to the basement, not even looking back to see if they were coming. I knew they would. They couldn't stop themselves. Their arrogance and their dawning fear wouldn't let them. As I descended the stairs, I heard their footsteps behind me, Miller's steady tread, and the heavier, more hesitant steps of the 3 men who thought they had gotten away with it. The power shift was happening. It wasn't loud or violent. It was the quiet, terrifying sound of a secret finally walking into the light. The family hadn't been exiled. They had followed me into my world, into the very place where their own story was laid bare. And in my world, I was the one who made the rules.
I flipped the switch, and the town of Havenwood sprang to life under the focused glow of the overhead track lighting. The effect on Miller was immediate. His skeptical, world-weary expression softened, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated astonishment. He took a slow step forward, his eyes scanning the incredible detail. "My God, son," he breathed, his voice filled with a reverence that felt like a balm on my soul. This is remarkable. This is the town. This is exactly how it was." He walked along the edge of the table, his fingers hovering just above the tiny buildings. He pointed. "That's the bakery. Old Man Hemlock's place. He always had a chipped ceramic baker in the window." He leaned closer. "You even got the chip." From behind us, Alistair scoffed. "It's a toy, detective. A meticulously crafted one, I'll grant you, but a toy nonetheless." Mike has always been good with his hands. The condescension was a reflex, but it lacked its usual bite. There was a new, nervous energy crackling off him. I ignored him completely, my focus entirely on Miller. This was for him. The vindication was a two-way street. I started this as a way to understand the official story of the heist. "Detective," I began, my voice steady and clear. But the official story never made sense to me. The witness accounts were contradictory. The timeline was full of holes, and the biggest hole of all, the getaway. No car was ever found, no tire tracks, nothing. I gestured for Miller to follow me to the far side of the table, where the railroad tracks ran through the industrial part of the town. Catherine, Alistair, and the uncles trailed behind us like a sullen Greek chorus. "The police focused on the roads," I said, pointing to the miniature highway leading out of town. "You set up roadblocks here. You were looking for a vehicle moving at high speed, away from the scene. Standard procedure." Miller murmured, his eyes glued to the model. "But what if you were looking at the wrong system?" I asked. I pointed to the train tracks. This system wasn't about speed. It was about patience and anonymity. I began my presentation. It was the calmest I had ever been in my life. The years of research, the endless nights of building and cross-referencing, all flowed out of me in a clear, logical stream. I was no longer Mike, the disappointing son-in-law. I was an expert, presenting my findings. "The heist took place during the Founders' Day parade," I said, using a small pointer to indicate the town square. "Maximum distraction. Most of the police force was occupied here. The first move, however, happened 30 minutes earlier. Over here." I pointed to a dumpster behind the town's volunteer fire department. A small contained fire, officially ruled an accident, but it drew the town's only fire engine and one of its 3 police cars away from the center of town. A classic diversion. I saw Gregory shift his weight. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. "The lookout," I continued, moving the pointer to the top of the church steeple. "The police report said they couldn't figure out the vantage point. But from here," I crouched down to get Miller at eye level with the model, "you have a clean line of sight to the bank's front door, the back alley, and both ends of Main Street. The perfect perch for someone with patience, someone who could sit still and just..." Bernard, the quiet one, took an involuntary step back. His face was ashen. Catherine tried to intervene. "This is insane," she whispered, grabbing my arm. "Mike, stop this. You're embarrassing yourself." I gently removed her hand without looking at her. The most critical piece of the puzzle, detective, was the timing. The thieves were in and out of the bank in under 15 minutes. They knew the response time of the state police to the silent alarm would be at least 20. But they still had to get out of the town, which was being sealed off. I moved the pointer to the railroad siding by the old grain silo. At 2:47 p.m. on that day, a mixed freight train, number 734, was scheduled for a slow pass-through, but it was held up. A signal malfunction. Down the line. It sat here. I tapped the siding, for 12 minutes. An unscheduled stop. The official report on the malfunction was inconclusive. "Probable weather-related damage," it said. Miller was leaning in so close his nose was almost touching the tiny trees. "We checked that train," he said, his voice tight. We searched every car. You searched for the wrong thing, I replied. You were looking for men, or for bags of money hidden in an empty car. But the money wasn't hidden. It was cargo. I reached down and carefully, with the delicacy of a surgeon, lifted a single boxcar off the tracks. It was the dull rust-brown one. I held it out on the palm of my hand. This car was part of a legitimate sealed shipment of industrial machine parts, heading to a factory in Ohio. Its paperwork was in order. Its locks were intact. There was no reason to break the seal on a legal shipment. Mike, for God's sake. Alistair's voice was sharp, a crack in his smooth facade. What is the point of this ridiculous theater? I turned my hand so Miller could see the side of the car. I pointed to the tiny stylized bird I had painted there. The point, Alistair, is this: a symbol, a marker, something only the thieves would recognize. I found a drawing of it, a smudge in a crime scene photo from the vault. It was dismissed as a doodle, but it's your doodle, isn't it? The little bird you've been drawing for 30 years. Alistair's face went from pale to ghostly white. He looked as if I had physically struck him. The car was pre-staged. I continued, my voice dropping, becoming more intense. The machine parts loaded as a coverweight. When the money came out of the bank, it was in canvas bags, brought to the waiting car not by the main crew but by a fourth man, a railroad employee who knew how to pop a seal and replace it without leaving a trace. I glanced at Gregory, whose face was now slick with sweat. The money was loaded in among the heavy machinery, and the car was resealed. The train moved on, and the money took a slow, leisurely trip 2 states away, to be collected from a secure depot a week later. It was brilliant. It was patient. It was almost perfect. I placed the boxcar back on the table and turned to Miller. But they made one mistake, the one thing they couldn't control: vanity. I then told him about the Shell Corporation, about the leasing company, about how Alistair Finch himself was the director listed on the ownership papers for that very boxcar. He didn't just use the train, I said, my voice ringing with the finality of it all. He owned the getaway car. The silence in the basement was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, broken only by the hum of the transformer. Catherine was staring at her father, her face a mask of dawning horror and disbelief. Gregory and Bernard looked like trapped animals. Alistair, for the first time since I had known him, looked his age. He looked old, and defeated, and small. Detective Miller slowly straightened up. He looked at the 3 brothers, his old tired eyes now blazing with a fire I hadn't seen before. It was the fire of a man who had been haunted for 2 decades, and had just seen the ghost. He didn't need to ask if it was true. He saw it on their faces. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He looked at me, a long searching look. In his eyes I saw it all: gratitude, shock, and a profound professional respect. He nodded once, a small sharp gesture. Then he turned away from us and made the call. "Yeah, it's me," he said into the phone, his voice steady. "Get a hold of the state DA. No, the new one. Tell him Frank Miller has a Christmas present for him. The Havenwood case. Yeah, that one. I just closed it." He hung up. The new reality settled over the room. The game was over. The charade had crumbled. I looked at Catherine. The woman I had loved, or thought I loved, was looking back at me with the eyes of a stranger. Her face was a maelstrom of emotions: betrayal, fear, but underneath it all, a sliver of dawning horrified understanding. She wasn't just looking at the man who had destroyed her family. She was looking at the man she and her family had created. "Mike," she whispered, the word barely audible. "How could you? How could I?" I replied, my voice devoid of the anger I thought I would feel. All I felt was a vast, quiet emptiness. "Catherine, you stood in this man's house." I gestured towards her father. "And you listened to him lecture me on building a legacy. This is his legacy. A clever crime and 20 years of lies. My hobby." I looked around at my beautiful, perfect world. "Maybe childish to you, but it's honest. It's mine. And it just told the truth. I think that's a better legacy, don't you?" She had no answer. There was nothing left to say. The foundation of her life, the money, the status, the smug superiority, had been revealed for what it was: the proceeds of a crime.
And the pathetic toy-obsessed husband she'd so casually dismissed was the one who held the receipt. The aftermath was both swift and agonizingly slow. The state police arrived within the hour. It was surreal, watching these uniformed officers so young they probably weren't even alive when the heist happened. Being briefed by a retired Frank Miller in my basement. He used my model as his primary visual aid, pointing out the diversion, the lookout, the sighting. Alistair, Gregory, and Bernard were taken into custody without a word. They were shells of the arrogant men they had been just hours before. The fight had gone out of them the moment Miller made that call. The truth, once spoken, had a weight they couldn't fight. Catherine collapsed, not literally, but emotionally. She sat on the basement steps, her face buried in her hands, making these small wounded sounds. I didn't go to her. I couldn't. The chasm between us was too vast to cross. The life we had shared was an illusion, and I had been the one to shatter it. Was there cruelty in that? Yes, I see that now. But there is also a cruelty in letting someone live a lie. And I had endured that for far too long. Debatable character logic, I suppose. Some of you watching might think I went too far, that destroying my own marriage was too high a price for justice. Others will say she got what she deserved. I've gone back and forth on it 1,000 times myself. What I do know is that a life built on a crime is a prison for everyone involved, whether they know it or not. I just finally found the key. The legal proceedings were a sensation. The model train heist. The papers called it. Frank Miller was a hero, a tenacious old bulldog who never gave up. He made sure, in every interview, to mention the brilliant civilian consultant who had provided the final pieces. He never used my name at my request, but he gave me the credit. He was a good man. That unsolved case had been a stain on his honor, and I had helped him wipe it clean. We talked on the phone a few times. He told me the district attorney was looking into the statute of limitations on the robbery itself, but that charges of conspiracy, money laundering, and decades of tax evasion were ironclad. Their legend became their indictment. Catherine and I started the divorce proceedings almost immediately. Our conversations were stilted, painful affairs conducted through lawyers. She accused me of betraying her. I told her that her family's decades of lies were the first and ultimate betrayal. She chose her side. She moved in with her mother, into that grand house that now felt tainted and hollow. The untouchable family fortune was frozen, subject to seizure and penalties. The life of casual luxury she had always known evaporated overnight. It wasn't about revenge, but there was a certain grim satisfaction in seeing the natural consequences of their actions finally arrive. My life became quiet. The big empty house was mine now, at least until the divorce was finalized and we sold it. The first few weeks, the silence was deafening, but slowly, it became peaceful. I didn't dismantle the model of Havenwood. I couldn't. It was too much a part of me. It wasn't a monument to my revenge. It was a monument to my revenge. It was a monument to my own quiet endurance, to the power of paying attention. It was a testament to the fact that the things people dismiss in you, the quiet hobbies, the meticulous nature, the obsessive focus can sometimes become your greatest strengths. So here I am, in the basement that is no longer a cave of man-childishness, but a place of quiet vindication. I'm telling you this story because I think there's a lesson in it. Maybe you're in a situation where you feel small, overlooked, or taken for granted. Maybe the people who are supposed to love you the most make you feel the least seen. They might call your passion silly, your dreams childish, but don't ever let their judgment define your worth. The things you build, the knowledge you gather, the truths you uncover in your own quiet way, that has power. They might not see it, they might mock it, but it's real. My name is Mike, and I was married to the daughter of a legendary bank robber. They thought my model train set was a pathetic toy. In the end, it was the one thing that was real in a family built entirely on lies, and it set me free. Thanks for listening to my story. It's been a long and complicated road, and sharing it helps. If you have a story about a time you felt underestimated, I'd love to read it in the comments below. It helps to know you're not alone. Don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and ring the notification bell. It really does help the channel grow, and it lets me know that these stories are resonating with you. Until next time, be true to yourself, especially when no one else is.